So what we'll do is we'll kind of spend some time together today exploring aspects that are looking at kind of Mashiach, Messiah, end of days, resurrection of the dead, how they're kind of very much an aspect, the final aspect of the 10 Sefirot that we've been talking about, and then kind of see where that takes us. What I'm going to do is I'm going to bring you over to my screen. Hold on one second. Here we go. Okie doke. Okay, so we kind of arrived now at the final one of the 10 Sefirot. And we were talking about over the last few weeks how each one not only is a manifestation or an emanation of one of the characteristics of God, but it's also an echoing or a mirroring of our own behaviors and our own abilities. So just again, I know I've been through this every single time, but just to go through again, the Ein Sof, we're talking about this idea of this infinite being, perhaps the concept of unity, the all-encompassing universe. We then get to Bina and Chokhmah, the idea of planning, both in terms of God, in terms of the planning that went into the creation of the universe, but also the way that we understand and look at psychology and the way that Kabbalah is used in psychology, the left brain, right brain, the concept of intuitive thinking versus kind of planned thought. If anyone that's read the book by Daniel Kahneman called Thinking Fast and Slow, Chokhmah and Binah fit in beautifully into the system 1 and system 2 of the human mind. So the way, I mean, this is again, it's if anyone who studies psychology or even behavioral economics, the concept that we have almost two aspects to the way that we interact with the world, one which is intuitive, one which is instinctive, known as system 1, and one which is kind of planned out and very much conscious, which is system 2. And Chokhmah and Binah link into those two ideas beautifully. And the way those two kind of interlink. If anyone who's read the book, I'm happy to discuss it with you and to go into more detail. For those that haven't read the book, I'd highly recommend it in terms of the way that just our mind works. It gives you an insight into the way that we think, the way that we make decisions. Again, links into Chokhmah, system 1, intuitive, subconscious, Binah, well thought out, conscious, planned thought. We then moved into the concept of then moving from the thought process into the practical world, chesed and gvura, the idea chesed of doing an act purely because it's good, gvura, doing an act because it's fair and that it's just, chesed versus tzedakah, the idea of love, mercy, kindness versus justice, realignment and judgment. There's a combination of that within our own lives that we want to try and bring together, which is the concept of tiferet, of beauty. And it's all about that kind of balance and interaction between the two. We then looked on to Hod and Netzach and Yesod, which kind of delved more into God's interaction in the world. And the way that we kind of summarized these concepts was the way in which fate and destiny manifest themselves within the world. That when we take a look at the world outside of ourselves, outside of our individual actions, we can be confronted with the problem of evil, right? Why do bad things happen to good people? Why do good things happen to bad people? And Netzach and Hod deal with those issues. They deal with the idea that we have to have some kind of emunah, some kind of faith. The number one, Netzach, that eventually the good, the righteous will succeed and be victorious. And the same way, on the opposite end, the Hod, that there are those who are deserving of judgment, who are deserving of retribution, their day will come. And Yesod is the point in which God enters into the world, the point in which we are maybe able to see and interact with God. That whenever we do a mitzvah, whenever we pray, whenever we meditate, the point at which we are able to connect with God is through this aspect of Yesod. Here you can see in English known as foundation. Sorry for the prelude. Hopefully I've recapped a couple of things. And we're going to look at Malchut today and how that kind of relates to the end of days. That Malchut, arguably, is the most important of all of the 10 Sefirot, because it's less to do with God's manifestation in the world and far more to do with us within the world. That when we take into account all 9 of these Sefirot, they should eventually bring us to the concept of Malchut, of kingdom, meaning the ultimate redemption for all mankind, for all humankind. Now, we emanate, and everything that we see emanates from God's creations. Ultimately, we should strive to be, by using these 9 Sefirot, the manifestation of what God wanted us to be. We see many different places within the Torah, for example, that every single human being was created b'tselem Elokim, in the image of God. And by us realizing that purpose, that creation, how to act, how to behave within the image of God, that's how we create Malchut. That's how we bring godliness into this world. And this is like a nice kind of comparison. Yesod, that is God actively involving himself in the world without a kind of any intermediary. Malchut is also God manifesting in the world, but through God's creations, through the beings and the general universe that God has created. The ultimate being that God has created, according to Kabbalah, is us. That we are that perfect combination of physicality and spirituality. We are the manifestation of the 10 Sefirot. And so Malchut, by us performing mitzvot, by us connecting to God, we bring Malchut, we bring kingdom into the world. Here's a nice way that's put over here. The first 9 Sefirot are the continuous stream of God's actions which strike humanity and affect us. When we absorb these and the influences of God and find them within ourselves, we change and thereby reflect God's essence. The first 9 are God's actions, the 10th is our actions. That in Malchut, God does not act merely by himself, but rather God acts through us. That if we are able to channel the spirituality and the spirit that exists within the universe, that's how we create Malchut. And that's, in a sense, at least for us as human beings, why it's the most important Sefirah. Obviously, each of these Sefirot we can find meaning in, we can find beauty in, we can find inspiration in, but ultimately Malchut is that full stop, or is the full stop. It's the period at the end of the sentence that says, okay, you've learned all these things, you've planned out, you've been good, you've learned this, you've done that. What does it mean? What's the end goal? My kids are watching the Marvel movies at the moment. What's the end game? Right? What's the end result of all of these pieces placed together? And that is Malchut. Now, the reason why, now you'll hopefully, you'll kind of see the connection. Malchut isn't just something which we're talking about right now, today. How can we go out and do this thing? It's very much related, particularly in Kabbalistic thought, and we're going to explore it today, to the end of days, to the coming of the Messiah. That Judaism very much, like other, not only faiths, but other ideologies, believes in an end of days, the end of the world, or eschatology, right? Not only Judaism, like when I say in religion, you see examples also, for example, in Marxism, in communism, for example, where there is this end goal, there is a utopia that you are aiming for. But in Judaism, it manifests itself with the coming of the Messiah, right? The belief and yearning for the coming of the Mashiach, which in English means the anointed one. Limshoch means to anoint, is one of the fundamental principles of Judaism, and we'll take a look and see why and how it's so fundamental and how it's interlinked with this final piece of Malchut within Kabbalah. And it teaches that world history, and we mentioned this last time also with Yesod and with Yehod, Yesod, and Netzach, that world history isn't just a random series of events, but rather there is a planned destiny leading to a utopian goal. And this Jewish utopia has three basic pieces. There's the Messianic era, there's the afterlife, and then there's the world of resurrection, or the resurrection of the dead. So what we'll do is we'll explore some of these pieces together. We'll take a look at some different sources. We'll discuss them. We'll stop off. At any point you want to jump in with different questions, please do. I know someone asked in the WhatsApp group regarding kind of a deeper dive into reincarnation. That we'll see if we get to today. When we talk about resurrection of the dead, that kind of links in. There is a concentric circle, a Venn diagram of resurrection of the dead, and also the Jewish belief in reincarnation. There are differences, there are similarities, and we'll get to those pieces. But this is very much for me anyway, when I was growing up, just a fascinating aspect to kind of delve into and to discuss, because you're talking about, right, what's the purpose of life? Like why do what we do? And so we'll take a kind of an exploration of that today. What we'll do is we'll go through a few different sources. We'll stop off. I'll point out some important pieces. We'll have some time to discuss and ask questions. And then we shall go from there. Before I even begin, let me just take it back a second. Does anyone want to share perhaps ideas or thoughts or kind of lessons they've kind of explored before as they relate to Moshiach, Messiah, end of days, resurrection of the dead, anything like that? Has anyone encountered any of this before?
May I share something?
Absolutely.
I recently, in 2016, I worked on a documentary film called the Third Temple, and the movement of the Third Temple and the Al-Aqsa reaction to it. And during the filming, we went to Korban Pesach in Jerusalem. And Korban Pesach, how would you like the sacrifice of Pesach?
Yeah.
And there I witnessed like the preparation of, the building of the Third Temple, with the Kohanim, with the dress, with the sacrifice, with the actual sacrifice, was a sheep, I think, and everything was kind of consolidated by psalms, by verses from the Torah, and basically these people believe that they want to accelerate the coming of the Mashiach. They want to first build the temple for the Mashiach to come. And I know like there's another group of Jewish, this was a kind of radical thought aspect of it, because they also want to destroy the mosque, and they're so radical about it. But interestingly, it was a movement of not just certain age or certain group, but a lot of people were involved, young and old, and it was this idea of like, this is the norm, this is what it should be the norm eventually. On the other hand, other Jewish groups, also Orthodox, they refute it, and they feel like it is even insulting, because according to the Torah or the scripts, the Mashiach will come, and then we'll be able to build the Third Temple. So yeah, I can send you the link to the film. It might interest you.
I would love, please send the link to the documentary. I've never personally been, I've seen clips of this, like the practice you're talking about, of them going to sacrifice the lamb. But I've never seen a kind of a full documentary of the piece. I would love that. But you're absolutely, we're gonna get to that very much today, because one of the questions is we're gonna deal with is there is now there is a spectrum in terms of how people interpret this particular belief, but there is one would say it's a very common belief, particularly in Israel today, amongst religious Zionists, that the modern manifestation of the state of Israel is the first steps of the coming of the Messiah. that and we'll talk about time frames and years, but this particular time now, as taught in Kabbalah, is getting closer and closer to the coming of the Mashiach, and certain aspects, as interpreted by religious Zionists, whether it is actually this is more to do with the Holocaust. With Kabbalists, whether it's the Holocaust, then moving into the establishment of the State of Israel, the reunification of Jerusalem. There are religious groups who see that as clear and obvious signs the Mashiach is coming. And then right within that spectrum, there are those who kind of go along for the ride versus those who are like, right, we actively have to kind of do everything we can, right, to bring Mashiach, as you said, Yona, to like reinstate sacrifices, even to go as far to say that, right, well, the only thing that's stopping us is that there's the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock on the Temple Mount, and we need to remove that. We'll talk about that a bit later. And then also, again, right, and then we'll get to that also, right, there's the Haredi world, the ultra-Orthodox world, although they very much believe in the Mashiach, they're opposed very much to any active steps that are taken by Jewish people to bring the Mashiach because of a certain Gemara found in Ketubot and a couple of other places that talks about, as you said, that God banned or forbid the Jewish people from retaking taking Israel by force and repopulating it. But we'll get that. Wonderful, perfect. We're going to get to that. Excellent. How are we in the Messianic age? What does Kabbalah say about that? Wonderful. Anyone else before we move on? Any other aspects of the end of days, resurrection of the dead, anything like that? Cool. Cool. Amazing. Let's go. I'm going to bring you back to my screen. So we'll take a look at a few different sources and we'll go from there. So number one, there's this aspect here, which we've used him a lot, the Ramchal, but he's an important Kabbalistic thought leader. His two most important books, he wrote a dozen books, but his two most important, Derech Hashem and Mesilat Yesharim, are you can get like English translation. Sometimes it's good to kind of have someone sit with you, even if someone else who doesn't necessarily have to have read the book, but to kind of work through it are really important just in terms of understanding the basics and foundational beliefs of Jewish mysticism. And he says it follows that the concept of the Messiah is that we have to perfect the world through our own free will. That God gave human beings free will, and after the sin of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and with that free will, it's now our responsibility, as he says over here, that we have a pure spiritual soul and an unenlightened physical body. Each one is drawn toward its nature, so the body inclines toward the material, while the soul leans toward the spiritual, and the two are then in a constant battle. If the soul prevails, it not only elevates itself but the body as well. The individual thereby attains her destined perfection. That is that first step, the individual step. There is a battle between physical and spiritual. Perhaps you could take it to good and evil. Within Jewish philosophy, we talk about the Yetzer Hara and the Yetzer Tov, the good inclination and evil inclination, or the angel and the devil sitting on your shoulder, telling you to do good, telling you to do bad. And you have this internal battle within yourself. And that if each individual overcomes their physical desires, that's the first step for the Mashiach coming. But not only that we, by following the 10 SEFIROT, like the 10 SEFIROT that we've been kind of exploring and talking about over the last few weeks, that's how we bring the world to this perfect place, right? That's what we've been talking about. The idea of the journey towards the concept of Malchut. Now, what's interesting is that unlike Christianity, unlike to some extent Islam, but not as much, we don't necessarily subscribe to a belief that we're going to be redeemed or saved by anyone, and that includes God. According to Rabbi Nosson Weiss, who wrote this book, Do We Want Mashiach Now? ultimately, God put us into this world to redeem ourselves. We have full agency. And the whole point of our existence in this world is the condition prevailing here that we make a suitable environment for human independence and for people to live freely and for their ability to kind of seek and improve their spiritual selves. This idea that mitzvot cannot be rewarded in this world comes to mirror that. That when we're in this world, number one, we're seeking to perfect it for all humankind, to make it a place that people can live in peace. Right? That's one of the key concepts of the Messianic era. But we shouldn't think that peacefulness has anything to do with a reward. The reward comes later on. Now, I mentioned to you before this idea of the Garden of Eden. And the concept of the Messiah, the Messianic age, all goes back to those very first few verses at the beginning of the Tanakh, at the beginning of the Bible. That initially, when Adam and Eve were placed in the Garden of Eden, this perfect existence, that in essence didn't need anything else. The issue was that Adam and Eve didn't necessarily have any free will. They were very similar to angels. They were spiritual robots. They didn't necessarily have anything testing them until they ate from the tree of knowledge, at which point a state of awareness of the reality that creation is spiritual and that physicality is a mere clothing that hides the true nature of reality was brought to the fore. And that at that very point, right, at that very point, the concepts of cause and effect, of reward and punishment, which was hidden at that point, was taken away. And the raw physicality of the world became the fore, when in fact, that was just kind of a mask placed in front of our eyes. The concept, the whole reason of Kabbalistic teaching is to flip that over. That really the physical world is just a mask, is just in Hebrew is a klippah, right? The word klippah comes up many, many times in particularly Hasidic teachings. Klippah, for those that know modern Hebrew, means like if you're talking about a fruit, it's like the outer casing of a fruit. What's that in English? Like the skin, all right? The skin of a fruit or the shell of a nut. It's that outer casing. And it's our responsibility by studying Kabbalah and by practicing mitzvot and certain aspects of Kabbalah to remove that klippah, to see the spirituality behind. Now, a very important phrase which is used very much in lots of different aspects, right? Tikkun OLAM. Tikkun OLAM essentially means to fix the world, is one which is become the fore for the Reform movement, for the liberal movement, and importantly so, right? The concept that Tikkun OLAM is what we would say is social justice, of bringing equality to the world, is paired up with also a Kabbalistic or more traditional take on Tikkun OLAM, which is the perfection of the world. That our mission is to bring the world back to the state of which that existed before the first sin of Adam and Eve eating from the tree of knowledge. And only then can this person raise themselves from that state to this destined level of perfection. Now, this is like dual interpretation going on over here. That if we get back to kind of Yona's piece on the way in which, particularly, let's say, Orthodox groups interpret this phrase of Tikkun OLAM, they're taking it from a purely spiritual standpoint. That by performing mitzvot, by being a quote-unquote good Jew, you bring the world back to this perfect state. That by me praying or putting on tefillin or hearing the shofar or fasting on Yom Kippur, I'm bringing the world back to that perfect state of the Garden of Eden. But in my opinion, equally as powerful, Tikkun OLAM as social change is also a legitimate way to interpret this concept as presented by the Ramchal, What we'll get to, essentially at the end of the day, the Messianic age is a time in which all people live together in peace and in harmony. Right, the very, very famous verse from Isaiah: the wolf will lie down, the wolf will lie down with the lamb, and that the people will turn their the weapons into plowshares, and no nation will rise up against any other nation. The idea of social justice and bringing equality into the world is also seen as a practical way to bring the Messianic age. And for whatever reason, infighting and politics within the Jewish world, which is kind of beyond the scope of what we're talking about, but we can talk about it at a different time, has kind of brought those two aspects apart, where one group kind of focuses more on the spiritual aspect and one focuses more on the, let's say, societal aspect, when in reality, the two things should really come in hand in hand. Now, this piece comes from the Maharal, given this is like the picture of a synagogue here in Prague, the Maharal of Prague. One of the most influential Kabbalists of all time. He was a bridge. He was a bridge between the kind of classical Kabbalists such as the Arizal that we studied a couple of weeks ago, and the Hasidic masters that came afterwards, like the Lubavitcher Rebbe, but like the Rav Shlomo Zalman of Liadi. He was the first Lubavitcher Rebbe. He was kind of that link between the two. And he begins to talk about, he begins to predict, when will the world enter this perfect stage? When will the world kind of end? And when will we live in this peace? And he talks about that the last 2,000 years of the thick 6,000 years of Jewish history are the days of the Moshiach. Quotes this from Avodah Zarah, Gemara, page of the Talmud. That this means the world, that toward the end of time is the most appropriate time for the arrival of the Moshiach, because it's the end, because basically we're getting towards the end. In other words, anything which happens at the end of a process is the completion and perfection of that particular process. Over here, the entire world will be united to the point where the whole world will be complete and perfect. And therefore, there will be this King Moshiach. We'll get into who this could be. The King Moshiach will complete and perfect everything, will come at the end of time, which is the most appropriate time for the completion and perfection. So many of you may have, I don't know if you've heard this before, that there's this idea that in the Jewish year 6000, that's when the Moshiach will come. Similar-ish to the way that we talk about 6 days of the week, and then the seventh day being Shabbat. When the seventh millennia begins, that will be the entering of the coming of the Moshiach. And that the way that history has been tracked by Kabbalists over the last 2,000 years, they place each event as kind of a manifestation of the coming of the Moshiach. Now we see this in the song of Chad Gadya, the end of the Passover Seder. If anyone's at the Chad Gadya, all right, if you're still awake at that time, where other than it being kind of a cute song, but also for those who maybe have read different commentaries before, you may be aware that each character in that song, the idea of a father selling a goat for 2 zuz, and then that goat being eaten by a cat, and the cat is then bitten by a dog, and the dog is hit by a stick, and the stick catches on fire. Each character represents a different nation that comes to destroy the Jewish people. For example, the cat, the goat is the Jewish people. We're talking about the Paschal lamb being represented the Jewish people. The cat, or the Sphinx, is representative of the Egyptian Empire. And then if we go later on, it goes, the dog becomes the Babylonians, I believe. Then it becomes the stick, which is the Persians. Then becomes the fire, which is the Greeks. Whatever. I'll send you over a commentary. But that idea that this kind of layer of history of nations trying to conquer the Jewish people, ending off with God kind of pressing the reset button and us entering into this perfect world. Now, the idea here of when will this take place? When is this redemption? And here I'll delve into here a few different sources over here. One I'm going to look at, which the Zohar mentions, Let's have a look over here, that the double expression, I shall see him, I shall look at him, it comes from the prophecy of Bilam. When the Jewish people are in the desert wandering for 40 years, Balak, the king of Moab, becomes scared of the Jewish people. He's seen what he's been doing to the Egyptians, and he sends a prophet called Bilam to go and curse the Jewish people. He sees their only weakness is God, and he feels like if a spiritual leader is able to curse them, that will bring that will be the downfall of the Jewish people. The Zohar mentions how there was only one prophet on equal footing to Moshe, to Moses, and that was Bilam. Even though he didn't necessarily have positive intentions, he was of equal power in terms of his prophecy to Moshe. And he goes and he begins, long story short, he's about to start his prophecy. He's about to curse the Jewish people, to end them, but out of his mouth comes blessings. The story involves a talking donkey, similar-ish to the story to the famous movie Shrek, but also quite different. And he begins to bless the Jewish people. And it's interesting that from Bilam's prophecy, we actually get the vast majority of our sources as regard to the Messiah to Moshiach. There's also a famous phrase in there, which some of you may be aware of Ma tovu ohalecha Yaakov, mishkanotecha Yaakov. How great, how wonderful the tents of Jacob, mishkanotecha Yaakov, the dwelling places, the houses of worship of Israel, talking about kind of the Jewish people, prediction of building the temple. But here he says, I shall see him, I shall look at him. When, according to the Talmud, is talking about the Messiah, the Zohar says if the redemption comes about on behalf of the merit of the Jewish people by them repenting and being good again, then it will be the most miraculous way. However, and the Redeemer will be revealed through miracle and wonder. However, if the redemption comes about at a predetermined time when Israel is not worthy of it, either way, the Messiah will come. Either it will come because everyone will seek to find peace in the world, or the world will fall to such destitution, to such a traumatic and awful state, then the Messiah will come. And many people have written about who the Messiah will be, what the Messiah will be like. There's a discussion between the Rambam, Maimonides, and the Ramban. Rambam talks about the Messiah being a regular individual, not anyone who could perform miracles necessarily, but a leader who will come and will bring world peace, will bring the Jewish people back to live in Israel, will build the third temple, and will reestablish a Jewish monarchy in the land of Israel. There are other writings, particularly Kabbalistic ones, that talk about the Messiah being an individual who could perform miracles, right? Similar to that's why, for example, the Shabtai Tzvi claimed to be able to perform certain miracles and saw himself almost like a Jesus-type character. And there are these different, there is different interpretations. For anyone who's been to Sfat before, there's the alley of the donkey, which you may have encountered before, which part of it is based on this verse here in Zechariah, book it's one of the prophets, one of the 12 minor prophets, that the Messiah, if the Jewish people don't necessarily do what they are supposed to do to bring about world peace and TIKKUN OLAM, fixing the world, the Messiah will ride a donkey. And there are different midrashim and different kind of folk tales. There is a particular alleyway within Tzfat where the Messiah will make his way to Jerusalem. The idea being that it's kind of a very humble, unassuming alleyway. Now, I mean, there's other questions, right, which you could talk about today. Well, we talk this like this is a very kind of masculine, heavy description here of the Messiah, of the Moshiach. I've had questions before of can the Moshiach be a woman? The answer to which is yes. We see many examples of female leaders even within Tanakh, right? Before it was kind of woke and before we even kind of imagined equality, what equality meant, particularly when it comes to education. But there are plenty of examples of female, not only leaders and head judges, but also and prophetesses and military leaders. But the language itself is masculine and heavy for various different reasons. But right, that's just a sidetrack. So how? So again, reiterated here again in Sanhedrin, that either the son of David, the Mashiach, has to be a descendant of King David to reestablish his throne, will either be because the Jewish people have completely made a turnaround and done shuvah and put hatred to one side, or the world will just be in such an awful place that will bring the coming of the Mashiach. Another example here, which many of you may have come across before, that there's a Gemara here that states that if the Jewish people observe just 2 consecutive Shabbatot, some even say just 1 Shabbat, the Mashiach will appear immediately. Interestingly enough, any of you who've been involved in the Shabbat project, like I know in the UK it was called Shabbat UK, Shabbat project, where kind of there's this global push for everyone to kind of keep 1 Shabbat together, and usually it's there's either a meal or a Friday night or Havdalah. That actually came about because of this belief, a push to kind of have Jewish people keep 1 Shabbat together, and then that will bring the Mashiach. Another really important piece here, which comes from the Sfat Emet, who was the second Gera Rebbe, the leader of the Gera Hasidic group, who in a sermon on Rosh Hashanah in 5641, which is about 130 years ago, around then, 135 years ago, that the way in which Mashiach will come if people will love each other baselessly, unconditional love. The reason that the temple was destroyed was because of baseless hatred, and the TIKKUN, the fix for that, is to love people unconditionally. Right, we're talking about this kind of idea of Tikkun Olam and social justice. That could maybe perhaps link into that. Another example comes from the Zohar, which talks about the coming of Mashiach is dependent upon every single individual. Again, if we are careful in avoiding both baseless hatred and speaking derogatory of one another, that will be the key. That will be the driving force for the coming of the Mashiach. Now we're going to get into the point which Yona mentioned before of when. Could it be that Mashiach will come now? Could it be that an individual will rise up, perhaps a political leader as we see it today, that would be able to bring the Jewish people back to Israel, build the temple, establish a kind of monarchy and bring peace to the world? Before I get into that, there is something very interesting about the day and the age we live in today that kind of begin to bring to light some fascinating aspects of Kabbalistic predictions of what the coming of the Mashiach will be. So, for example, there is a verse in the Torah which talks about how the Jewish people will be returned on kanfei nesharim, on the wings of eagles. That from the 4 corners of the earth, the Jewish people will return to Israel. And for thousands of years, commentators and Kabbalists just kind of, that's what a weird phrase. Maybe it's metaphorical. Maybe there will be these giant birds like in the Lord of the Rings that will fly us all to Jerusalem. We now live in an age where we kind of do have these, winged eagles known as planes, which will also, there's this kind of story, I don't know how true it is, that when the aliyah of Ethiopian Jews to Israel, many of whom had never seen a plane before, were aghast and taken aback when they saw these iron eagles, as they called them, when they were flying back on the wings of eagles, this realization of this prophecy. Another one too is the ability for all humankind to know that the Messiah has come. Right, the Rambam talks about how when the Mashiach arrives, there'll be a great noise, there'll be a great sound, and the world will kind of know the Mashiach is here and the end of days are approaching. Again, up until let's say let's say up until 20 years ago, right? That again was kind of pretty far-fetched. If you want to go back, let's say 80 years before the invention of the wireless, again, a very weird idea that the whole world could know something pretty instantaneously, whereas in today, that very much is just the existence that we live in, that we sometimes we both love and hate, that we kind of know what's going on potentially in every single corner of the earth at every single moment. Again, a different discussion for a different time, whether or not our brains have evolved to be able to cope with that type of information and that form of dread, but still, right? But the idea that we can know what's going to happen again is for me at least, is interesting. It's interesting, perhaps even fascinating. Now, the idea that, again, when we look at the realms of history, controversially, I want to add, that particularly Kabbalists take the look at history, particularly at the events of World War II and the Holocaust and the near destruction of European Jewry and the murder of 6 million Jews, the creation of the Jewish state, see that very much as the hand of God and the coming in of the Messianic age. When I say controversial, there are, again, I have mentioned this before, but there are other Jewish philosophers, Telushkin, by Sachs, who are uncomfortable with this idea of trying to attribute any form of godliness to anything that could have taken place during the Holocaust, because look, you have to kind of like, number one, you have to then kind of then state, well, then God in some way was responsible for the Holocaust, and then everything that comes along with that statement. There's another piece which Rabbi Sachs talk about, just says that, well, you have to be very careful when you speak about the murder of 6 million Jews, and there's a certain reverence that comes along with that. And he says that, listen, you have to be prepared that whenever you say anything related to the Shoah, to the Holocaust, you're saying it in front of 1 million burning children. However, there are those who are so deeply involved in Kabbalah, again, for good, for bad, see beyond the real suffering and death and destruction purely in the realm of spirituality, which can make people feel, on the one hand, depending on an individual's makeup, inspired or sickened. Again, that's for you to kind of draw your own conclusions. There was a piece where Rav Kook, who was the first chief rabbi of Israel, who called Theodor Herzl Moshiach ben Yosef. There's a concept within Kabbalah that there are two messiahs, Moshiach ben Yosef and Moshiach ben David. Moshiach ben Yosef, according to the Zohar, isn't necessarily, again, a quote-unquote traditional Jew, someone who is necessarily observant, who will help bring about the coming of the Moshiach ben David, who is a more kind of classical Jewish leader. And Rav Kook would often refer to Herzl, a secular Jew, however, the founder and leader of the Zionist movement, as Moshiach ben Yosef. Rav Kook, the founder of religious Zionism, which essentially its core foundational beliefs, sees the modern day state of Israel as the first steps to the coming of the Moshiach, and everything within that as these steps towards the Messiah, saw Herzl as this foundational figure. Here, one of the most important traditions regarding Messianic age concerning gathering the diaspora and the resettlement of the land of Israel. And again, there is now a spectrum within the religious Zionist movement of how that plays out in the real world. Whether it's, okay, we just kind of have to kind of take a step back or be proactive. And it manifests itself also in Israeli politics. You look at the disengagement from Gaza in 2005, one of the reasons why there was such a huge uproar within the religious Zionist community was because you're kind of taking a step back of bringing the Moshiach. How could you give that back? Now, one of the most confusing and difficult aspects to kind of wrap your head around with regard to the coming of the Moshiach, beyond the building of the temple, which in itself is confusing, beyond the gathering of the diaspora, which is less confusing because we're seeing it manifest today. Beyond even the realm or hope that there could be world peace is this more miraculous aspect of resurrection of the dead. Now we see it in kind of reality and practicalities with the Mount of Olives, which we'll get to in a moment. And I've put in a few different sources here which mention or are used as the foundational belief of the resurrection of the dead. Maimonides, the Rambam, places it as a cornerstone of Jewish belief, which is strange because he doesn't mention Shabbat as a cornerstone. He talks about there's 13 principles of faith, one of which is that God exists, one of which is that God gave the Torah to Moses, one of which is that we believe, Ani ma'amin be'emunah shleima, I believe with complete faith that Messiah, the Mashiach will come. And even though the Mashiach may be delayed, I still wait for the Mashiach every single day. And that one day, everyone will come back to life. Now, with that statement, obviously comes dozens and dozens of questions of what that means. Now, a really beautiful piece here, just to explain at least the concept behind the resurrection of the dead, again comes to the Ramchal, which is, in order for the world to be perfected, it needs to go through some kind of destruction before it can then be perfected. So too, us, made up of a body and a soul, needs to go through some kind of destruction in order to be perfected. According to the Ramchal, that destruction is the concept of mortality. That when we die, we get buried, and then we come back in a perfect state. Here I've put in Armageddon. Armageddon is actually a Christian notion mentioned in the book of Revelations, that the end of the world will begin at a mountain in the north of Israel called Har Megiddo, Mount Megiddo, which also could be translated as, if you re-say it in a certain way, sounds a bit like Armageddon, Har Megiddo, Armageddon. I mean, again, I'm not sure here to teach Christianity, but anyway, this is an interesting piece. That's where the rapture will begin. However, there is also a concept of this idea of Armageddon, this kind of destruction before the perfect messianic age in which we will all live in peace with one another, and that the central principle of resurrection of the dead, as taught by the Arizal, is continuously taking place even in this world as we find more and more of the physical world being harnessed for the good of man. Is all to be used in the service of man, and when we use this for the service of God, both us, human beings, and the world rise up higher and higher. There is a concept going back that perhaps, so here Rabbi Ehud Rakovsky in his Da'at Tefillah talks about us using the world for a higher purpose. The Arizal talks about the destruction of the world. The Zohar mentions a few different pieces. Let me just draw out one thing over here. It talks about how he compares us and the world to a tree in which the roots, hold on a second, let me try to move this out of the way so I can read this, sorry. Here we go. Talks about how that if all the dead bodies rise up from the dust, what will happen when a number of bodies share the same soul in succession? Okay, we're talking, this is where kind of there's this Venn diagram of resurrection of the dead and reincarnation, that there is a basic belief, at least according to the Zohar, that one soul had multiple bodies. Says Rav Yossi in the Zohar, that those bodies which were unworthy and did not achieve their purpose will be regarded as though they had not been, just as they were withered like a withered tree in this world, so they will be regarded at the time of the resurrection. Only the last body, the one that gave the soul the most spirituality, will be a tree that was planted near, like it was near water. This alludes to the body that struck deep root, etc., etc. He quotes a few different psukim from Jeremiah, i.e., he will not be included in the resurrection and will not see the light stored up in the creation for the enjoyment of the righteous, which is a kind of a interesting take, right? That only I mean, it's a bit difficult. It's kind of like when you have, if you've like got your significant other and you're comparing yourself to their past partners, and you know, sometimes you can get a bit anxious of how you stack up. Well, according to the Zohar, your soul also has past partners, and you have better stack up well against them according to the Zohar, because otherwise your body won't come back. Anyway, the next piece of the Zohar also talks about what would each body, like how does that even work in terms of the bodies, what do they look like? The bodies buried closest to the land of Israel will get there first. The bodies that are buried further away will then get there last, where the tradition comes for Jewish people to be buried on the Mount of Olives, Har HaZeitim, close to the Temple Mount. So they'll be the first to arrive with the coming of the Moshiach. So that tradition, huge tradition, when you walk into your city and you see all those gravestones, right, on the Mount of Olives, comes from this piece in the Zohar, being buried as close as possible to Jerusalem. Now, just to kind of finish off, and I'll tie some things together, but the idea is this, that, actually I'll go back to the very beginning, we'll go our way through, that when we're talking about the final piece, the final emanation of God in the world, the final emanation of God in the world is us. We are the ones that bring Malchut. We are the ones who are responsible to perform TIKKUN OLAM, to fix the world. Whether you interpret that as a spiritual TIKKUN, a spiritual fix, by being good, quote unquote Jews, by performing mitzvot, or you see it as a form of bringing world peace and equality and social justice, or you see it as a meshing between the two, it's our responsibility, because we were created b'tselem Elokim, in the image of God. The era of the Messiah will be brought about by us manifesting our free will and choosing, as I've said many, many times, to bring spirituality into the world using the physical world. By doing so, we will bring the world closer to what it was with the Garden of Eden, a place of peace, a place of tranquility, a place where individuals, both Jewish, both non-Jewish, will be free to practice and believe whatever they wish to practice and believe, and not impinge on anyone else's practices and beliefs. Again, that comes from the Rambam, chapter 12 of his Hilchot Melachim and Milchamotehem, the laws of kings and their wars. There are various different aspects and discussions as to what the world will look like, who the Messiah will be. The idea being, however, is ayin lo ra'ata. We don't know. There are many today, as Yona pointed out, who believe that we are in the Messianic age. And right, they could be right, they could be wrong. Some people will take a very active step, which again, maybe counterbalance, doesn't necessarily bring balance to the world when you're seeking actively to destroy someone else's own particular faith. Again, I won't get into that too much, but again, you take that as you wish. But the point here is this. This world is comparable to the reception before the world to come. The world that we live in is just the preparation. Prepare yourself in the reception. Do what you can to be a good person. Do what you can to bring light and happiness and love into this world. So that when you prepare yourself in the reception, you may then enter the banquet hall. You may then enter the world to come. You will then bring the Messianic age. That essentially is what we have been learning about. We've been learning about how we can see godliness in the world. We've learned about how we try and manifest that, what we can do, how we see ourselves, ultimately to make the world a better place. That's what Kabbalah is about, essentially. That is what we've been discussing and we've been exploring together. I'm happy now. I know I kind of went quite a long time just talking without any breaks. If anyone has any particular questions on this particular piece, anything I've covered now, I'll be very, very happy to answer any questions, continue any discussions. In general, again, I'm very, there's a bunch of you who have been reaching out, like generally during the course. I'm always here should you have any questions, or you want to explore something. The best way to reach me is on WhatsApp, and I'll then we can continue the conversation. Questions, concerns, thoughts, anything with the last few moments that we have together.
I have a question.
Yes.
Because it seems like it's very full of contradictions, right? The Messianic age, like they're talking about peace and and then they say there will be a kingdom, and which seems kind of like the opposite of peace and like democratic things. And and all of these groups that are trying to bring the Messianic age are actually, like you said, like recently they're doing a lot of things that seem the opposite of peace.
Okay, beautiful. Okay, so the way I would see it is like this: again, it is very much up to interpretation. I know that's not a great answer, but let me explain what I mean. That with the Messianic age at its source is not just peace for the Jewish people, but peace for the entire world. And again, a lot of these sources were written at a time when the Jewish people were a persecuted people. Now, what happens is when you take a persecuted people, you take a nation or a group who have been spread out in the diaspora, living as a minority for thousands of years, and then place them within their own country and give them that autonomy, that's when it becomes their responsibility to do good with that newfound power, with that newfound promise. Now, from what we know, and we have this like new challenge that up until Israel was declared a state, everyone kind of, at least religious individuals, Kabbalistic individuals, saw the benefit of kind of grabbing every single opportunity to try and bring the Messiah, because that meant that Jews could kind of live in peace and not be persecuted. Now that we have Israel and we try and kind of wrestle with monarchy versus democracy, right? Living with other people who also claim the land, in my opinion, it's about taking an approach that kind of moves closer towards that vision of Isaiah, that miraculous world, or that peaceful world of the wolf who lie down with the lamb, and we turn our weapons into plowshares, and no one will raise up a hand against anyone else, rather than seeking actively to harm and hurt other people. That really, for me, is what the coming of the Mashiach is. When we talk about then becoming more aggressive, it doesn't necessarily work in the world. It doesn't work, right? It just creates more animosity. It creates more hatred. It doesn't bring us any closer to peace. And there are contradictions there. There are always going to be contradictions there. And although we always hope, when like in Judaism and Kabbalah, we hope for the Mashiach to come, it's that balance of knowing what it takes to make peace, what it takes to bring about a messianic age. Is it violence? Is it intimidation? Is it pushing boundaries? Or is it understanding who we're going to have to share this world with? That's how I see it. But you're right. There is no easy answer. We live this. It's a world of contradictions. Yes, Yona.
Hey, we constantly hear by not only Chabad, but I personally frequently like the Mashiach now, like the coming of the Mashiach too. We want for the Mashiach to come. My question is it only like the religious, those who somehow reached certain perfection that wish that? And therefore, like as a Jew is not practicing or observant, or still there's a lot of work to do in myself, should I also wish for the coming of the Mashiach, or it's something that I need first to work on myself and work on like preparing myself, as you said earlier, like for the coming of the Mashiach?
So there's two pieces there. Number one, the idea, look, the Chabad piece is unique, because that's a whole different story, that they believe that the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who was alive who died in the 90s, was the Messiah. He died, whatever. That's a whole long thing. And again, in my opinion, if you're focusing too much on the end goal, you miss out on the process that's going to take you to the end goal. And you could say the case of those people, perhaps they're at a place, they're at a state where they're like ready to do that. I think it should be the other way around. I think it's about focusing on that preparation. What's my place? How can I be a better person within myself? The way that I process things, the way that I act, the way that I interact with others, the way that I show unconditional love. if I focus on those minutiae, the rest will take care of itself. You talk about behavioral psychology, you talk about fostering positive habits. It's all about working on those little pieces, the small victories, the small wins of making yourself a better person that then will lead to the greater ones. If you just focus on the bigger picture, you'll stumble, you won't get there, you won't build up, right, the right behavior patterns, both as an individual and as a community to get you to that place. So that's how I see it. For anyone who would like to continue the conversation offline with any other questions, anything else, it's been a real pleasure, a real pleasure to learn with you and to hear your questions. Please do send anything you wish, the link to the documentary, questions, anything like that. And I hope I get to see any of you one day soon. Take care, everyone. It's been great. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's been fabulous.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.